We've read the end of chapter 1, or section 1.2. What makes anthropology anthropological? Which is a good question if you think about it, because I've told you that anthropology is the study of humanity, which seems way too big and overwhelming and huge to do. We talked about in the last class how we divide that up sometimes into the 4 fields of anthropology. So we talked about biological anthropology, archaeology, cultural anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. But in this section, they ask the question that across these fields, how do you know when somebody's doing something that is anthropological? So how do you know if you're in an anthropology class as opposed to a sociology class or a psychology class or even a biology class? What makes anthropology distinctive or anthropological? The first thing that's perhaps good to point out is that all across the subfields, the influence of symbols and learned behavior on human life. That unlike other creatures, there are very few instincts to guide what we do as human beings. We are guided by the things that we learn from our peers and from our parents, from our elders, in order to adopt a particular way of life, which we'll call culture. And without that, without being a particular kind of human, you can't really be a human at all. Humans who are raised outside of the human societies really usually don't make it very far. And if so, they're not really considered part of a concrete human society. And we are also extremely governed by our use of symbols and our interpretation of symbols to guide our behavior and to organize our lives. It's very odd and strange and maybe a little bit cruel that here you are at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and through the use of symbols, I can get you to be here and sit in these stupid chairs and copy a bunch of things down, and for the most part, sit still. No other creature in the world would submit to this kind of ridiculousness. The baboons would be long gone by now. They wouldn't be sitting here copying things down. Chimpanzees would be having a lot more fun. Hell, most other humans wouldn't even submit to this. They'd be off doing something more useful in their life, like hunting or fishing or gathering. But here we are, because of symbols, because supposedly we're learning things, because you want something called credits and a grade, which is just a number or a thing on a piece of paper, if you even get a piece of paper, or a diploma. Here we are, which is all to get some other symbols, like money, which is just numbers on a piece of paper or a screen. I don't know what we're after that for. All you business people wanting those numbers. Who cares? Go off and fish. Do something useful with your life. Nobody's jumped up yet. Boy, the power of symbols is terrible. Like I said, it's very cruel. Here we are. Nobody's left yet to go do something useful with their lives. You're still sitting there poised for the next move that I'm going to make on a symbolic PowerPoint slide. Here we are. Some of you have resorted to other forms of symbols like texting somebody. Can you believe this shit, man? Come on. So that is one thing that unites the anthropological subfields, is our concentration on this learned behavior and the peculiar nature of human life that is governed by and influenced by symbols. Our textbook also outlines 5 core values and practices. So we'll go through these in order. This is just my list of them now for your consumption, and we might as well start with the first one, which was field work. This is a picture of Dr. Lawrence Ralph, who did field work, does field work in Chicago with people who are involved in gang violence. Why do you like field work? So field work is the idea that you need your data somewhere outside of a lab, an office, or a classroom. And so you're going out to get data. Now, I will caution you, you are probably not in danger of becoming an anthropologist, but for the most part, to do that actual field work is, for most anthropologists, is a small part of their lives. They do that for maybe if they're going into cultural anthropology for a year in another society. But most of their life as an anthropology is going to be in a classroom or a lab or standing up in front of students like this. So if you want to go fishing, you should just go fishing. You shouldn't become an anthropologist because you think you'll be able to get out there in the world. You just got to get out there. But yes, we need to get out there. And there's a number of reasons why we may want to do it. One of the reasons why is because much of what we know about human beings and human variation comes from studies within our own society. So, for those of you who are psychology majors or political science majors or even sociology majors, most of the studies that have been done on human beings are done on people in either European or North American societies. And many of the psychological studies, for example, that tell us about the human mind were done on undergraduates, college students who had to sign up for some psychology experiment that they submitted themselves to. So a lot of the different approaches to life have never actually been documented. Yes, that's exactly correct, which is the sense that when you dig something up, an artifact or a fossil, for one thing, a lot of things were never left behind. So there's not that much to dig up, really, because most of our lives we spend trying not to become fossils. And the artifacts that we have are often our leftovers or our garbage. So there's not that much, and it can be interpreted in different ways. If you think about an archaeologist of the future, digging up some of the stuff we have, they might be puzzled about what exactly we would do with such a thing. And the same thing happens when we think back in the past, not just about what this object is, but what that object might mean. And so to give ourselves a window into that, doing field work on contemporary people and the things they do with objects and the things they do and the meanings they make of their lives can give us a little bit of a possible window into past societies. It isn't foolproof. You want to be careful of just simply extending what you see today back into the past because people are not living fossils. As we talked about with the Naki Rama, who are Americans, remember, societies are constantly changing, they are constantly in motion. So we need to be careful about taking evidence from the present and projecting it back onto the past, but it can give us some ideas about what might have happened in the past when we find an unfamiliar artifact or an unfamiliar object. So you need to keep doing field work every so often because all societies are in change or in motion, not just our own. The idea was that you're on top of things or grounded in, focused on something outside of your own head and your own textbooks or something like that. So keeping research grounded and focused. Now, in order to do field work, our authors advise that we need to take up the perspective that we talked about in the first class of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism means when we consider other societies, we do it in the context of their own values. Going back to the idea that our behavior is learned and often governed by symbols, what we want to do is understand what other people are doing in the context of the things that they have learned, in the context of the symbols that they use, not necessarily imposing our own learnings and our own symbols and our own values onto other people. Now, I definitely want to be very careful with this. This does not mean anything goes. This is not the same as what we might call moral relativism. When Dr. Lawrence Ralph is studying the influence of gang violence from a culturally relative perspective, it is not because he's like, oh, yeah, that's their culture. That's just what they do. That's cool. He's trying to understand what's going on, perhaps in order to actually suggest changes or to suggest ways in which these harmful effects might be mitigated, or as we'll talk about later on, research for positive change. So being culturally relative means being able to understand what somebody is doing from their perspective and their reasons for it. It does not mean that is necessarily a good thing or something we want to agree with or something we want to be like, yeah, that's fine. That's just what they do over there. So we want to be very careful about that. It's a method of understanding, not of any kind of ultimate approval. One of the next things your textbook discusses is the idea of comparative approaches. So how do you know you're doing something anthropologically? How do you know you're studying something anthropologically? You have probably done some sort of comparison. Now, there's several kinds of comparison that we can do. If we're talking about those macaques up there and how they're sleeping together, a cross-species comparison. So yes, this is probably a little bit different than you do in your political science classes, a cross-species comparison between, say, human beings and macaques, or macaques and chimpanzees, or other kinds of species. That would be a cross-species comparison. If we're then going to talk about a comparison with human beings and societies in which you might sleep together or close with your newborns, what kind of comparison would that be? We might consider that to be cross-species as well, but when we start dealing with different human societies, then we make this cross-cultural comparison and talk about different cultural practices. And as some of you noted, the places where there aren't artificial lights, where they don't rely on such bright illumination all the time, tend to have sleeping patterns where people sleep more together, sleep more in groups, don't have a necessary bedtime that is governed by a symbolic clock and those kinds of things. So it's perhaps more like what other species do, but is also exhibits cross-cultural difference. I would like to throw in another kind of comparison, which usually we reserve for the discipline of history, but it's also part of anthropology, which is a historical comparison or across different time periods. So if you look back, say, 100 years or 150 years in US society, you will actually see a lot of the same kinds of co-sleeping infant care patterns that we might see in other societies today. So we can make cross-species comparisons, cross-cultural comparisons, but also historical comparisons. I should probably add too that there is going to be variation within any society. So there are a number of people who do things that might be considered according to their culture or their social pattern, but there are others who might be doing something else or adopting a different pattern or deviating from that pattern. Another possible reason that you know that you are in anthropology is if you are embracing diverse scholarly traditions. I have renamed this as the one-word title of generous, or being capacious or wide-roaming in our sense of what might contribute to our scholarship. There were no people that said this was something that they found exciting, which is fine. This is not perhaps the most exciting part for you of anthropology, but anthropology embraces both sides of it in which we test hypotheses or falsifiable predictions. That often occurs perhaps more in biological anthropology, as we talked about, but we also embrace a humanistic side in which we talk about what things mean to people and their stories and their personal experiences and the choices that they have made, and ways they might interpret things. And we put these things both together, and we don't want to exclude one or the other. And so the anthropologist Eric Wolf, a long time ago, said that anthropology is the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the sciences, and they quote him on page 13 of the textbook. And it's something that anthropologists don't always necessarily live up to, but it's something we aspire to, is to embrace both humanistic approaches when you're doing your literature classes and your creative writing classes, but also embracing scientific stuff. Part of this generosity, or part of this embracing of diverse scholarly traditions, means thinking about the ways that other people have looked at the world, not just our own. So when we are studying other people, we are also studying how they might think about or look at the world. And we might think about, when we're doing our field work, what kind of knowledge or what kind of knowledge practices they already have that we might think about or learn from. This applies, for example, to a lot of knowledge about plants and animals. The people that are actually hunting and fishing and wouldn't be sitting around in this stupid classroom might have something to tell us about the birds and the fish and the other creatures out there that goes beyond what we might get from a laboratory setting or an analysis of DNA. And so one of the aspirations of anthropology, again, anthropology hasn't always been the greatest at this, because we did emerge from a European and US context in which certain people were in a colonial situation, were said to go study other people. But the goal eventually is the creation of knowledge with people, to go to study with people and to learn from them, not just performing studies on or extracting knowledge from them. So we do not want to study other people in the way that we might study insects or DNA or those things, or put other people under microscopes. What we want to do is learn from and with people. And that leads us to our next part, or how we know anthropology is anthropological, which is the idea of making research relevant. That it is not just what we want to study from an abstract, outsider, scientific perspective, but ideally it's going to be something that the community or the people in that area are going to find useful or helpful. That was a great quote. Real world challenges. So what this is known as applied anthropology, trying to use that research to address things that people are dealing with in their lives. So there might be a problem, there might be an issue with, say, maybe this is why our criminal justice people like it. There might be an issue with crime in a society, and there's one perspective that approaches it from a policing perspective and says you need to lock up the people. But there's another perspective that might ask, well, why are people doing the things that they are doing in the first place, and how might we make adjustments to our social order so that people will choose better outcomes for themselves? So that might be an example of applied anthropology. Your textbook also mentions activist anthropology, which would then take that a step further and try to convince people to, or help people to try and make political changes in their own society. So there's applied anthropology, which is to take anthropological research in service of a community, but there's also anthropologists who become convinced that you need to do more things than simply study people, that you might need to take some sort of political action. For example, if you were studying different forms of gun violence in Chicago, you might become more interested in how you might politically prevent the flow of guns into Chicago. And so that is perhaps a different way of thinking about what anthropology can do. Your textbook says that it can also encourage community healing. And it gives you the example, or this picture is of an anthropologist, and they were actually doing forensic anthropology, looking for kids who had been missing from some of these schools, and they were found to be subjected to violence. And the forensic anthropology was able to uncover some of this, and uncovered some unmarked graves and those kinds of things, and find out what had happened to these poor children. And in doing that, Bell encouraged a community healing that was able to at least give some truth to what had happened to these people in the past, and then encourage solutions to that. Going on from that, also the idea of You can use anthropology in different ways. In addition to the study we talked about, how it might support law enforcement. How can anthropologists do that? Yeah, so some of the things that it may seem abstract to work on bones and forensic osteology, but one of the ways that people use that is to identify victims of crimes or injustices, to try and figure out what was done to people in order to support the efforts to bring others to justice. Your textbook mentions that many anthropologists, or some anthropologists, tried to work in government policy offices, try and bring more intelligent policy options to government officials. Some anthropologists have been a part of the U.S. Agency for International Development, for example, to try and figure out how to best distribute things like food and other resources to people that they may have once studied as anthropologists. As you may know, all of these people are being thrown out of the government right now, so we won't be doing that much for the next few years, but maybe someday. Anthropologists also sometimes conduct research in industrial settings, which may seem a little far afield of what we traditionally think of anthropologists studying biological stuff and evolution and those kinds of things. But anthropologists study culture, and they can study how, for example, an assembly line is organized, or how an advertising campaign is being conducted, and how it might be culturally sensitive or used in a better way. The fifth reason you hopefully know that an anthropologist is doing good anthropology is a commitment to a common code of ethics. I think one of the most important parts of this code of ethics, or at least for me, is don't harm the people that you are studying with. So try to avoid bringing harm to other people. If you are studying with other people, don't mess them up. And when you're studying other people, what you want to have is what we call informed consent. People should know that they are being part of an anthropological study or an investigation. You're not trying to be a spy or observe people from a distance. If you're doing participant observation, you are participating and observing at the same time, and so people should have some idea that that's going on. Again, this hasn't always been the best in anthropology, but we try. What we want to do is place a priority on the people who are being studied and not necessarily our own interests. Now, again, this is something that the lines become fuzzy sometimes, because anthropologists too want to get knowledge and get a degree and do their anthropology thing. But in general, this is a goal of anthropology, and that we should be engaged in a constant self-reflection of this. So if we are observing people, let's say we start out from the fact that we don't think we're influencing people with our observations, and so we don't need their consent. But as time goes on, we start to think, well, actually, this observation might be something that we need to talk more to people about, that you're engaging in a reflection on that and trying to improve your practices as you go along. So those 5 things our authors tell us, and they add in the idea of culture or learned behavior, or how you may know that you are studying human beings from a more anthropological perspective as compared with some of the other perspectives that you were all involved in your studies here.